لورد جيفري ديل خبرته كبيرة جدا في مجال الأمن وفي مجال مكافحة الإرهاب، وكان لقاؤه مع وزير الدفاع الفريق صدقي صبحي مهم جدا، وسمع للفريق صدقي صبحي في هذا اللقاء الكثير، وسمع له أيضا وزير الدفاع. انطباعاته مش بس عن مصر، انطباعاته أيضا عن بلاد تانية في المنطقة، عن الوضع الأمني اللي موجود حوالينا. في نفس الوقت زي ما حضراتكم برضو عارفين ان الوفد اللي موجود ما جاش بس زار الحكومة، ده يمكن قبل ما يلتقي بالرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي كان بيلتقي بالمجلس القومي لحقوق الإنسان، كان عنده لقاءات مع السيد عمرو موسى، كان عنده لقاءات مع دبلوماسيين مختلفين. فالصورة اللي هم بيكونوها مش مجرد صورة من رئيس دولة ومن وزراء الدولة، لا، الصورة بيكونوها من أطراف مختلفة ومتعددة. تعالوا نشوف لورد جيفري دير. The Honorable Lord Jeffrey Dear, it's a pleasure to host you on Cairo 360.
Osama, it's a pleasure to be here, thank you. My first visit to Egypt, and I've enjoyed it immensely. Far too short.
It is the first visit to Egypt?
Yes.
Okay. And that surprises me a bit because you are an expert on a number of security issues, and a lot of things have been happening in Egypt and around Egypt when it comes to security. So how come it's your first visit?
Well, life has taken me all over the world, at least to America, of course, many of the countries in Europe, the Middle East, India, but never to Egypt. But I know quite a lot at second hand about the Egyptian situation, and I hope to be able to help in the future.
Let me start by asking you, before asking about the visit and your meeting with the president and the defense minister and others, but let me ask you about how do you see this security issue happening around the Middle East these days?
Well, the Middle East is very fragile, as you know. It is split. Economically, it's split on religious grounds. Ideology is getting in the way, I think, of common sense in many ways. With common sense, I think the leaders can pull themselves and their countries out of it. But without common sense, I think there are real dangers. And one sees, of course, what is happening quite recently in the last few days in northern Iraq as one example of many. The problems go back a long way.
And how do you see it, I mean, in terms of this, the Muslim extremists taking over many countries, or at least they are trying to disrupt the regimes in different countries? How do you see it?
Well, again, I use the words again. It's creating a very fragile situation. I mean, the Western media frequently uses the word Muslim too widely. I mean, there are so many hundreds of thousands, millions of very sensible, deeply religious, committed Muslims who are no threat to society at all, either their own society or anyone else. And the numbers of extremists are relatively small. But the damage that those few can do to their own country or to other countries, of course, is quite profound. And it is a matter of, I think, bringing common sense to bear, a question of hearts and minds, perhaps internally and externally, to lead to a situation where people can live together with tolerance rather than with hostility.
But why is Britain not concerned about the Middle East, which is the backyard of Europe?
Oh, I would argue against that. I think Britain is very concerned about the Middle East. I mean, who cannot be? The Middle East is a pivotal part of the world. It sits, by definition, between Europe and Africa, the Far East and America. It's almost a crossroads of the world, and always has been historically. And so, if the impression is being gained that Britain is not concerned, I would disabuse that. I think it is Britain is very concerned.
Concerned in terms of seeing the danger looming from these movements, from these small groups, as small as they are, but still they're very effective?
Looming perhaps is the wrong word, but certainly there is a danger. We've seen that, and it would be foolish to ignore that. The dangers are well known, that small numbers of very determined people, with or without arms in their hands, but often with arms in their hands and explosives as well, can wreak terrible damage. And the terrible thing is, of course, that having done what they're going to do, they don't seem to make life any better. In fact, life frequently becomes worse as a result of their actions. So we're in this spiral, which doesn't take anyone to a better place.
Do you think the investigation by the British government into the Muslim Brotherhood activities, whether they relate to terrorism or not, would you think that this will yield something significant or yield something solid?
Well, it might. I'm politically independent, as you know, and I'm not part of that investigation.
Sure.
And although I would read the results with some interest, the Muslim Brotherhood is not the only politically inspired group, of course, but it's politically important, of course, to Egypt for reasons that we all understand. And the reason I think that the investigation is being carried out at the moment is to try and get a better understanding of just where the Brotherhood actually does stand and what it does stand for, rather than perhaps a cursory view which some of the media in the UK have accorded it.
Right. Let me go back to the visits that you've had for quite a busy schedule in 2 days, and you've met with the president.
It's been a packed schedule.
Yes. Tell me first about impressions about meeting with President Sisi.
Well, I had not met him before. Some of my colleagues on this visit had met him before he became president. Sure. This was my first introduction to him, and I was very, very impressed. Very impressed indeed. He said the things that one would hope he would say, but there was a sincerity behind it. Trying to judge as we all do, the man behind the words, as it were. And he is obviously deeply sincere, deeply committed. And I believe he has an enormous will to see through the policy which he's recently outlined to the people of Egypt.
And with that sincerity that you sensed, of course you have concerns because you've met, for example, with the Human Rights Council before you had that meeting. So how did these conform together, or was the meeting with the Human Rights Council not significant?
Oh, it was significant. I mean, human rights in many countries in the Middle East and in Egypt as well is a big issue and has been for a long time. And the president, in his inaugural address, of course, addressed the issue of human rights very early on, almost up front, in what he had to say. And it's a truism, I think, that if you are going to combat terrorism, the nation concerned has to address its own human rights issues as well. Because terrorism tends to grow from within. Very rarely can it be imposed from outside. Of course it can come from outside. But usually the real threat is from within your own country.
That's the most difficult to fight.
Exactly. And if that is growing from within your own country because of dissatisfaction with the state, often with the police or with the security services or the army or whoever it is, then you have a tiger by the tail. And so human rights, quite apart from the need to treat people decently, which is obviously a paramount, there is another big payoff that if you do it, you damp down the chances, reduce the chances of having terrorism growing within your own country.
But we know that there are people who have been dissatisfied with the government and the system of the government, and these are the ones who went out to the streets. But we know also that those who were behind terrorism were not part of these, but were part of people who wanted to take power in their own hands. And that's a little bit of a different story, because no matter how you improve human rights, this portion of the people will remain dissatisfied.
Of course. There's no simple quick fix to this. And nobody, certainly not I, am pretending that countering terrorism is an easy business. It's not. But you certainly start off with a much better chance if you address the human rights issues, because you've got to address them anyway. If you're going to have a decent, tolerant, sensible society with freedoms that we all understand and we all strive for, they've got to be in place first. You could argue that they've got to be in place even before you start to address issues of health and employment and infrastructure and education. Of course they're important.
And he spoke to you about these particular issues as being part of human rights.
Yes. Yes, that human rights are part of those as well. But you could advance the theory, I think. I would certainly advance the theory that the fundamental of all is a stable, sensitive, fair, properly organized structure within the country where people feel safe and people feel their rights are being protected. And then everything else can be grown on top of that.
Almost every other guest that comes to me on Cairo 360 cites the statement made by Mr. David Cameron: when it comes to national security, then human rights should take a step backwards, something to that sense.
Did he say that?
I guess so.
I don't remember him saying that, and I certainly would not subscribe to that. I think there is always a tension between countering terrorism and insurgency on the one hand, and protecting the individual rights on the other. But I think if as we say, push comes to shove, you have got to protect the human rights side of that argument. Because if you let it slip, you're on then a slippery slope downhill. The mechanics who might be listening to a program will know what I mean by the ratchet effect. You can wind up on a ratchet, but you never go back on it. And if you destroy or damage some aspect of human rights, strangely, you can never recover it later. A politician who says, believe me, we will meddle with something, we will change something, and when we get the situation right, we'll go back to where we were before.
It never happens.
Never happens. Never happens. And so human rights, what we tend to shorthand in the UK as sort of Magna Carta principles. Magna Carta anniversary next year. 1215 has its anniversary next year. Those Magna Carta rights are very, very important and should not be tampered with.
Right. So once again, I'd say when you go back home, and how will you address other members of the House of Lords or Parliament or the media? What will you tell them about Egypt? What have you seen that has encouraged you, and what have you seen that has discouraged you?
I don't think I've seen anything to discourage me. I came well briefed, and I see that Egypt, of course, has huge problems. Nobody could argue with that. Unemployment is massive. The lack of inward investment, the lack of investors who've left this country before, education he's looking at, health, all of that. But the President knows about that. And there is a great sense that I have spotted in a very brief visit, 2 days or so. There's a great sense that grows from the President and all the others, ministers and others who we've spoken to, that the past is behind and the future beckons. And I don't think any of them expect a quick fix. They will want to score on some points fairly quickly. Of course they do. The first 100 days are important to a politician, of course. But they are moving into a new regime. There's no doubt about that. And I'm very heartened personally, A, that I believe that they have seen the sort of things that I applaud, and clearly they applaud as well. Egypt is a great country. It has had a great past. It has undoubtedly a great future. And I wish it luck.
You've met with the Minister of Defense, and we know that there is quite a part that is happening that is dependent on the Egyptian army, taking into consideration that many Arab armies have fallen apart in the past 10, 12, 13 years, ever since the invasion of Iraq, and then what followed in the past few years.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you see the role of the Egyptian army, both locally in Egypt and regionally?
Regionally, I think one would recognize that the Egyptian army is very well equipped and very well led and very well trained, and it is well respected. There is no doubt about that. The role that the army has been forced to play internally in dealing with internal problems, of course, is well known. And although it's for the President to decide, I would imagine, from what I've heard, that the army will tend to look more towards the protection of the external boundaries and allow the police to grow, the police to recast itself with due regard to human rights. This very difficult balance we talked about before, with law enforcement on the one hand and protecting human rights on the other. There will be an interface, of course, between the police and the army. There always is. And that interface will need to be worked out by the President and his advisors between the army and the police. If you like to use an expression, as the army moves out, the police will fill something of a gap, which the army previously... But that may be a bit difficult
for the example of Sinai, for example.
Well, if you move out onto Sinai, and I'm not an expert on that part of the situation, but the army, I would have thought, would continue to play a very similar role in Sinai. But I was thinking more within Egypt itself.
Within the cities, the main
Within the cities,
cities.
yes. within central Egypt.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I see the police taking a greater role. It's an area that I understand, policing I understand, and counterterrorism I understand. They will need to move forward from where they were to where they want to get, and there will be that interface with the army. But I would expect to see over the next 2-3 years or whatever that the army play a lesser role within the country itself, and perhaps a greater role in the wider Middle East.
A greater role in the Middle East.
Well, if they are not distracted is the wrong word, but if they are not preoccupied to the same extent internally, of course they can spread themselves more in terms of their influence. And the influence is something which is not for me to suggest. It's very much a matter for the president. But I go back to the point I made. The Egyptian army is a very well-trained, well-disciplined force. In army terms, a force to be reckoned with. And that is something which is not always present in the Middle East.
Yeah. You've met with many politicians, starting the president down to ministers and so on. Did you get a chance to meet with other normal citizens out on the street, or drivers? Or
No, well, drivers, yeah, I'm a great believer in drivers. Taxi drivers in London are a fountain of information, and I guess they probably are here too. No, it is one of the things that we have not done so much on this, hardly at all on this visit, and I would hope to come back soon and have a chance to have more spare time and meet, as you put it, real people. But I remain impressed with the people I've met at governmental level.
Well, you'll have to make up for the many years you haven't visited Egypt by more frequent visits. But on behalf of regular Egyptian citizens, I'm thankful to you for taking the time and the pains of being here.
Osama, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. مجموعة اللقاءات اللي قدمتها لحضراتكم ممكن ما تكونش غطت كل أعضاء مجلس النواب وأعضاء العموم واللوردات اللي موجودين من بريطانيا، ولكن على الأقل بتدينا انطباع الناس خرجت بإيه، هترجع بلدها تقول إيه عن مصر. احنا محتاجين مثل هذه الزيارات. يعني مرة تانية بشكر الأستاذ سمير تكلة اللي هو يعني واحد من الناس اللي نظموا هذه الرحلة، ومعاه رجل الأعمال المصري محمد فريد خميس اللي ساعدوا على أن الرحلة دي تحصل. والاستجابة اللي حصلت الحقيقة من الحكومة للقاءاتهم كانت استجابة أذهلتهم، أن الكثير من أعضاء الحكومة كانوا راغبين في أنهم يلتقوا بيهم ويشرحوا لهم وجهة نظر مصر. الكلام ده بيحصل على مستوى بريطانيا، زي ما قدمت لحضراتكم من حوالي شهر لما رحت بريطانيا والتقيت أعضاء مجلس نواب هناك وغيرهم. محتاجين ان ده يتكرر على مستوى البلاد الأخرى، على مستوى الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، على مستوى فرنسا، ألمانيا، على مستوى بلاد في الشرق الأقصى، لأننا محتاجين ننقل صورة مصر وصوت مصر للخارج إذا كنا فعلا جادين في أننا نبني اقتصادنا الفترة اللي جاية ونواجه التحديات. الناس كلها شايفة في تحديات قدام مصر كبيرة جدا، لكن زي ما سمعتم من ضيوفنا النهاردة ان كلهم عندهم امل ان الفترة اللي جاية هم متفائلين بيها انها تحقق للشعب المصري اللي هو عايزه، لان ده بالتالي هينعكس عليهم هم في اعمالهم وفي استثماراتهم الفترة اللي جاية.